Everybody. So we're going to review through chapter 1 just to make sure that we got all the information we needed and that we understand what we need to be able to move on to chapter 2. So remember we talked about the Clovis people. These were the people that came over the Bering Strait. That was between Russia and Alaska, down through North America, Central America, and South America. So just to give you a reference here, you notice Russia right here and Alaska right here. The Bering Strait, before it was covered up by the ocean, used to be a thin land bridge right about here that people used to cross over into North America, down into Central America, down to South America. It was a major part of their migration. So we know that many of the people that came through that land bridge ended up being of Asian descent, and we actually had also some European communities that came over, and we found this through DNA of Native American tribes that archaeologists have been able to uncover. This is known as the Archaic period. If you have a hard time remembering what archaic means, think of archaeology. It's the study of old stuff, right? Study of human remains and their past items that their culture used to use. So things like pottery, writing. Okay, this is ancient history. This is around 8000 BC. You have Paleolithic societies. What does that mean? That means nomads, hunter-gatherers. They eventually evolved into those Neolithic communities that we tend to think about when we think of Native American tribes being sedentary, having agriculture, raising livestock or hunting large game, such as buffalo, and having a trade network. So this is whenever tribes would trade other tribes for goods that they still needed. This would eventually involve the European nations as they came into the area. So the growth of civilizations. This is the growth of tribes throughout all of the Americas. First we have Peru. Remember that is the side that's on the western South American border. That is right over here. The western South American border. Okay, we also have a single government system along this 2,000-mile route and an irrigation system. Remember, irrigation has to do with water, bringing it to your vegetation. We also had a large network of paved roads. This was a big deal. Having a system in which people were able to travel to one another. It made trading more efficient. It made having government officials travel through the country more efficient. We have Mesoamerica. Remember that is the region involving Central America. That's Mexico and all of those nations. It's an easy way to remember it. You see Meso, remember Mexico, and it'll help you remember what part of the land we're talking about. In there, we had the Olmec. Those were the first people that settled in Mesoamerica. This was between 1600 and 1500 BC. We had the Mayans. They were also known as the Maya. This is in 1800 BC. So this civilization occupied Central America. Remember, this is the same thing. It's synonymous with Mesoamerica. And that Yucatan Peninsula. So that Yucatan Peninsula, right over here, this little bump you see, this is the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay? They had a written language, they had a numeric system, they were extremely advanced for the time period. They had an accurate calendar, they had an advanced agricultural system. Remember, they had those aqueducts we were talking about. Those were the pipes that were bringing water over to their crops. We also used step-down elevation, making stair steps down through the land to be able to bring water to your crops that way. We have the Aztecs. They took over a portion of the Mayan territory. So any part of it that occupied current Mexico, that is the part that the Aztecs overtook. This was in 1325 AD. They built Tenochtitlan. This was a huge city, similar to New York. When you think Tenochtitlan, think New York. It was huge. There were large public buildings. There were schools for male children. There was an organized military. These civilizations that had this organized military, that had this very elaborate trading system, allowed for them to become very powerful because they were able to obtain goods to be able to support that military. They had a medical system. They had a slave workforce. And like many other people, the tradition of that time was to take your slaves from conquered tribes or from conquered people. And then remember that the Aztecs were also known for this water navigation system that was similar to Venice in Italy. If you think of Venice, you think of the water pathways through there, the gondolas, people taking the boats through instead of having cars. That was Tenochtitlan. It was the same idea. So North America, most tribes used hunting, gathering, and fishing. They were nomadic. Remember, nomad means that people do not settle in one place. They tend to move with their food sources, move with their resource sources. So, for example, they tended to follow the migration patterns of large game. So, in other words, they tended to follow the large animals. Wherever they went, the tribes followed. So, for example, there would be buffalo in there. We had the Inuit. Remember, they lived in the Canadian region, so they're similar to the Eskimos. Think Inuit, think Eskimo. They live in a very cold climate. It was very far up north, over up in here, northern Canada. That is where they lived. It was very, very, very cold. They fished, they hunted seals, they hunted large game in the forest, anything that they could find, and a lot of this focused on moose and caribou. We had sedentary societies. Some of these were the tribes of the Pacific Northwest. So they survived off things like salmon fishing. They settled along the coast, this area from New York to Maine. Over in this area, that is where they would have settled, over there. We have tribes of the far west. Remember that in the far west, it's very arid. It's very desert-like. Okay, so if you think far west, you look over here, this area here, this would be near Arizona. Arizona is very, very hot, right? It's a desert. It's very dry. That's where the southwest tribes used to live in. So they would have to deal with that climate. We also had fishing, hunting. They ate small game, and they also ate any edible plants that they could find. So one of our major agricultural societies that there were the Pueblo of the Southwest. Remember, those were in New Mexico. Okay, when you think New Mexico, think Pueblo. They were there from the 900 AD to 1150 AD. The population was around 15,000. They had 12 towns and 200 villages. They lived in something known as Chaco Canyon. This is northwest New Mexico. It was made of sandstone, timber, and adobe. Remember, adobe means clay. It was 5 stories high, 600 rooms. So let's think about this for a second, guys. 600 rooms, 15,000 people. That's a lot of people in one room. And this is, a lot of people forced into 600 rooms. And this is going to play a large, large role whenever the Pueblo, being so close together, are introduced to smallpox. It's going to reduce their population greatly because of the distance that people were from one another. It was the last structure of its kind until the 1880s. So it was a very long gap between those two. Okay, we had the Hopis. They lived in small masonry villages. This is stonework. When you see masonry, that means stonework. Okay, they farmed corn. They had that elaborate irrigation system. Remember that that's the aqueducts and the terraforming, the forming of the earth to move the water. They had a very ceremonial culture. That means that a lot of their culture depended on ceremony. Things like religion, things such as becoming a warrior, that type of thing. They had a trade network that stretched across Arizona. Remember, we talked about how tribes that had trade networks tended to be the strongest because they were able to get those supplies to be able to support their tribe and to be able to grow and to become vast in number and in strength. We had the Zuni. They also based in desert areas of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. They built the large stone adobe villages built on a plaza. So if you think about it, there would be a plaza right here, and then they would have had their houses going around. They had elaborate pottery. They farmed corn and other important grains. We also had this city center of Cahokia. Okay, so remember how we talked about Tenochtitlan was like the New York of Central America? Cahokia was like the New York of North America. It was a trading center near St. Louis, Missouri. It was around 1200 AD. They had a population of 40,000 people stuffed into an area of 6 square miles. It's a small amount of area for that amount of people. They traded crops, hand tools, and pottery. So the Northeast, a lot of these tribes ended up being nomadic. Remember, nomadic means to move around. They used farming techniques that grew crops quickly because they did not stay in the same area for very long periods of time. They also used any resources they could find quickly, gathering vegetation that they're able to eat, gathering wood that they're able to use to build important tools and housing. These areas tended to wander along the Mississippi River. Remember, they needed that water source. One of these tribes was known as the Algonquian. They lived along the eastern seaboard from Canada to Virginia. So let me get down here. So from Canada all the way to Virginia, that's right about here. That's where they occupied. Going back down. Okay. Then we have the Iroquois Confederacy. They were centered in upstate New York. That's the northern eastern seaboard. So that would be around here. And we had the Muskogean. So they occupied the southern region of the eastern seaboard. So that would have been around this area. Okay, so many Native American societies were matrilineal. What's matrilineal? When you think matrilineal, you see this word matra right here. Think matriarchy. It's the exact opposite of patriarchy. You think patriarchy, it's ruled by men, patriarchs. Matriarchy is ruled by woman. A silly way you can use to remember this. Mama, woman. Okay? Family lines followed female lines instead of the male line. So for example, to put this into perspective for you, after marriage, the man would take the woman's last name as part of following those lines and those traditions. Women were responsible for care for children, meal prep, and gathering food. We had the Hopi. Okay, in that tribe, women and men had the same authority in the household. This is a huge deal. Over in European households, women had almost no say in what went on, and even had to be escorted by their sons. Once their sons reached a certain age, the woman or the mother would have to be escorted by her son to certain places. That was not so in this civilization. Women actually took on leadership roles. They had power over the household. That means they would have had power over their husband when it came to matters of the household. They also had power over the economy and trade deals, especially between their families, and over their social systems, how things ran. They also had the right to refuse or renegotiate a land deal or a trade deal. So say if their husband went to another tribe or another family and said, I'm going to give you this amount of land for this amount of corn. The woman could say, no, I do not agree with that. That's not going to work for me. We're going to need double that amount of land if we're going to give them corn. Okay? Men took on religious and political roles within the Hopi society. Okay? So that's it for this half of the chapter. The next half, European exploration, we will explore in the next video, in the next screencast.